Elias Grant sat in the farthest corner of the airport cafe, a worn corduroy cap casting shadows across his brow, as if it, too, had long grown tired of light. At 76, his body had surrendered to time in slow increments, a spine that no longer fully straightened, fingers that trembled slightly when holding the white ceramic coffee cup, and a left knee that buzzed with ghostly pain each time he shifted. But none of these aches betrayed the true weight he carried. The morning crowd moved around him like water around a stone, vibrant and fluid, never once pausing to acknowledge the quiet man who observed them all with the distant calm of someone long uninvited from the rhythm of ordinary life. Families bustled past with children dragging colorful suitcases, young professionals with their AirPods and confidence, and couples clinging to each other like lifeboats. He watched them all, not with envy, not quite with sorrow, but with a slow, aching recognition that their world no longer overlapped with his. On his wrist, half hidden beneath the sleeve of his army green field jacket, was the faded outline of an old tattoo, the eagle, globe, and anchor of the United States Marine Corps, entwined with the archaic lines of a Mark V diving helmet. It was almost indistinguishable now, blurred into the creased topography of his skin, like a memory trying to forget itself. Elias wasn't heading anywhere special. Not by most people's standards. A flight to San Diego. His granddaughter's college graduation. The first time in a decade he'd traveled for anything that didn't involve a hospital bed or a VA office. She had written to him, months ago, in a letter thick with hope and trembling cursive. "I want you to be there, Grandpa. I know it's been a while, but I want to see you when I walk across that stage." And so, for reasons he hadn't fully examined, perhaps guilt, perhaps love, perhaps the last stubborn thread of purpose, he had packed a small bag, boarded a bus to the airport, and arrived 4 hours early, just in case. He sipped his coffee with the focus of a ritual, ignoring the clamor around him. A young man's voice in line caught his ear, sharp, fast, full of energy and coded military jargon he hadn't heard aloud in years. Elias didn't look up. Not at first. The voice belonged to one of those special breed, Navy most likely. SEAL, judging by the cadence and casual dominance. He could smell them from across the room, ambition, danger, and youth still drunk on the illusion of invincibility. He closed his eyes. For a moment, his mind conjured a smell, salt water, diesel, rust. A sound, rotors pounding overhead, the crackle of a radio in his ear. Then a face. Mike Stratton. Grinning even under fire. Dead in 66. Elias opened his eyes before the memory could finish sharpening. He didn't notice the young man approaching until he was standing 2 feet away. "Sir." The voice was more formal now. Uncertain, but respectful. "I couldn't help but see the ink on your wrist. Were you force recon?" Elias didn't answer right away. The question wasn't unwelcome. It simply needed to pass through layers of time before it could reach him. Finally, he nodded once, slow and firm. Company A, 1962–65. Before that, Little Creek, UDT. The change in the young man's expression was almost imperceptible until it wasn't. Behind him, 2 others had stopped mid-stride. One muttered something under his breath that Elias couldn't quite hear, but it made the older man feel like something ancient had just been uncovered in the sand. "Jesus," the younger man said. "You're one of the originals." Elias let out a dry breath that might have once been a laugh. "No one's original. We're all just chapters in the same book. Some get footnotes, some don't." There was a pause. That kind of reverent pause only those who truly understand make. "I'm Sergeant Logan Reyes. DevGru," he said finally, as though he were offering the name of a cathedral. "My team, we study guys like you. You laid the ground we walk on." Elias said nothing, but in his chest a small part of something rusted shifted. May I sit?" Reyes asked. Elias gestured with a faint flick of his fingers. He didn't mind. For once, silence wasn't empty. It had weight. Shared weight. They talked. Not much. Not in long stories or dramatic revelations. But names were shared. Stratton. Price.
call burn.
Terms like LZ X-ray, Mekong, Holloway insertion. Each word like a chisel against granite, revealing history beneath history. Reyes listened with the posture of someone hearing sacred scripture. The younger seals circled nearby, half casual, fully alert. One of them made a phone call. Elias didn't notice. 20 minutes later, a woman in uniform arrived. Airline staff. Breathless. Mr. Grant? Sir, we've just upgraded your ticket. You'll be flying first class. Gate B12. Departures in 30. Elias blinked. Ma'am, I didn't. It's already arranged. She smiled gently, then glanced at Reyes, who nodded once. You'll be escorted, sir. He didn't move right away. Then slowly, like an engine turning over after a long sleep, Elias stood. He turned to Reyes. You didn't have to. Reyes straightened, his voice quiet but steel-edged. Yes, we did. They walked side by side to the gate. When it was time to board, Reyes stood back as Elias stepped forward. Before the gate agent scanned the boarding pass, the young SEAL said, voice rough with something almost like awe, "Thank you for clearing the path, sir." Elias turned, met the eyes of the man who might have once been him, decades ago. And for the first time in a long time, he said words he'd once believed were buried with his brothers. The honor was all mine, son. And then he walked on, a quiet man once again, but no longer invisible. The plane cut through the sky like a thought halfway formed, bound westward beneath a canvas of bruised blue clouds. Elias Grant sat by the window in seat 2A, first class, though he wore the label like an ill-fitted suit. The leather seat felt too soft against a spine used to steel frames and foxholes. Around him, passengers ordered wine and flicked through entertainment screens, unaware, or unwilling to see, the man quietly folding himself into the edge of their world. He stared out the window. Below, the country spilled itself in endless tones, patchworks of green and gold, desert ribbons, specks of light that might have been cities or just memories pretending to still be alive. His reflection shimmered in the glass. He barely recognized the man in it. His eyes, sunken, pale, still carried echoes of jungle rains and night raids, of whispered radio codes and blood that refused to wash out of fatigues. Some things time softens, others it preserves in glass. He thought of the young man at the airport, Reyes, and the brief conversation that had both warmed and unsettled something in his chest. There was admiration in that boy's voice, reverence even, but also something deeper, a hunger. Elias knew that hunger. He had once worn it like armor. The hunger to be forged, to be part of something that mattered, to be remembered not just as a man, but as a mark in history's ledger. It was a fire that burned away innocence, one mission at a time. Across the aisle, a young woman sat beside her son, maybe 6 years old. The boy clutched a small plastic action figure, one molded in the shape of a modern soldier, complete with body armor and rifle. At one point, he held it up toward Elias and whispered, "He's a hero." The mother smiled at her child, but didn't follow the boy's gaze. She didn't see Elias, or if she did, she mistook him for just another old man in a seat by the window, lost in his thoughts. And perhaps she was right. The word hero echoed in his ears with a strange hollowness. Not because he denied its weight, but because he had known what it truly cost. He had carried friends in body bags. He had read letters from mothers that began with, "Please tell me he didn't suffer." He had buried names inside his chest, whole lives folded into a half salute, half confession. Heroes, he knew, weren't the ones with medals. They were the ones who never came home. Or worse, those who did but couldn't bear the silence that followed. His mind drifted backward unbidden. Okinawa. 63. The rain there had a thickness to it, like it wanted to drown not just your skin but your thoughts. He remembered the face of a man named Dawson, barely 19, eyes too soft for the world they were in. One night, Elias had found him weeping behind a weapons crate. The kid had just written a letter to a girl back home. "I told her I'm fine," Dawson had whispered. "But I don't even remember what fine means anymore." Dawson didn't make it out of Da Nang. The pilot's voice broke into the cabin. We're beginning our descent into San Diego. Please fasten your seatbelts." Elias exhaled through his nose. He realized his fists were clenched. Gently, deliberately, he let them unfurl, one finger at a time, like surrendering something invisible. The mother across the aisle caught his movement, looked up. Their eyes met for a split second. It wasn't much, just a glance. But something passed between them. In that glance, she saw what the boy had missed. Not a hero in full color, not a statue made of iron and glory, but a man made of absence, of weight, of having endured more than he was ever meant to. She smiled, soft and sad, then looked away, blinking too fast. The plane landed with a thud and a groan, the way old bones settle into sleep. Elias waited until most passengers had disembarked before standing. He moved slow, methodical, each movement deliberate, less from pain now, and more from a sense of carrying something fragile inside. At baggage claim, his granddaughter appeared like spring after a long war. Tall, dark curls, eyes sharp like her mother's. She ran toward him, arms open, no hesitation. He braced himself, but when she embraced him, something inside his ribs gave way, not painfully, but like a door unlocking from the inside. "You made it," she whispered against his shoulder. He didn't say anything, just held her tighter. Behind them, people passed with their suitcases and calls and small, forgettable lives. But one boy, the one from the plane, watched from beside his mother, still clutching his plastic soldier. He saw the old man hold the girl. He saw her wipe something from her eyes. And he didn't ask any questions. Not that day. But somewhere, in a tiny corner of a young mind just beginning to understand silence, the seeds of memory began to grow. The house stood on the edge of a canyon, battered slightly by coastal winds, wrapped in salt and the muted hush of Pacific mornings. It was small. Elias Grant never needed much, but every corner of it had been touched by time. The wood floors creaked not out of disrepair, but memory. The fireplace was unused, yet somehow warm. Photographs lined a narrow hallway, black and white ones faded to sepia, men in uniform standing shoulder to shoulder, a little girl with a lopsided grin. A life lived in quiet chapters. He had only meant to stay for the weekend. See his granddaughter graduate, eat cake with names scrawled in pink icing, take a photo with her in a cap and gown. But one night became 3, then a week. And now, 10 days in, he stood at the kitchen sink in a home that wasn't his, rinsing a coffee mug as morning light carved slow gold across the tiles. Something in him refused to leave. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't ease. It was something older, more primal, the soft gravitational pull of gratitude not yet spoken. His granddaughter, Emma, had opened the door not just to her home, but to a part of his life he had long since locked behind iron and ritual. He watched her now through the window, sitting in the backyard with her laptop on her knees, barefoot in the grass, speaking to someone on a video call. Her laugh rose, light and unburdened. He didn't know how she had grown into such grace, but he felt it, each time she walked into a room without fear, each time she asked about his past not with pity but reverence. He had nothing to give her. Not in the way of inheritance or land. No stocks or bonds or family crest. But he knew stories, ones buried deep in the marrow, ones that smelled of mud and cordite and quiet courage. And he had discipline.
Skill.
Still, even now, a kind of sharpness the world had dulled, but not extinguished. So he began to fix things. It started with the porch step, a board that had cracked, just slightly, enough to be ignored but not forgotten. He replaced it without announcement. Then the screen door that stuck when it closed. The gutter along the left side of the roof. The faulty knob on the garage light. By the end of the week, he had organized the shed, sharpened the garden tools, sanded down the dining table where years of elbows had worn small dents into the grain. He did it all in silence. No declarations. Just motion. Precise, deliberate, full of care. A language he understood better than words. Emma noticed, of course. She said nothing at first, watching as each morning he rose early, tucked in a shirt as though reporting for duty, and sought out something broken to restore. One afternoon, she returned home to find him standing in the garage, staring at a disassembled bicycle. It was her father's. Hadn't worked in years. She'd almost thrown it away twice. But Elias had cleaned it, oiled the chain, replaced the inner tubes. The handlebars gleamed. It wasn't about the bike. She knew that. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked, stepping beside him, arms folded across her chest but soft-eyed. He didn't look at her right away. When he did, it was with a quiet that felt like a held breath finally released. "Because you asked me to show up," he said. "And I did. And now I want to stay useful. That's how I say thank you." She didn't speak, only reached out and laid her hand gently on his forearm. And that was enough. The next day, a letter arrived. No return address. Inside, a formal seal. An invitation. The Department of Defense, Veterans Oral History Project. They wanted him to speak. Share his account. His story. He almost threw it away. But that night, he stood by the open window, the sound of crickets folding into the dark, and he thought of Reyes, the young SEAL, the way he had looked at Elias not like a relic, but like a cornerstone. He thought of the little boy on the plane, plastic soldier clutched in his fist. He thought of Emma, who had believed in him without needing a single war story to prove it. So he answered yes. Weeks passed. Elias stood before cameras in a quiet government building, voice steady as he recounted names and places long buried. He didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize. He spoke with precision, as if laying bricks. When he spoke of loss, he paused, not to weep, but to honor. When he spoke of courage, it wasn't his own. He spoke their names, one by one, like a litany, not ghosts. Brothers. The recordings were archived, digitized, shared in classrooms. One day, a boy in middle school would hear his story and go home to ask his grandfather if he ever knew a man named Elias Grant. And slowly, Elias began to see the shape of his gratitude, not as a debt, but as a gift. A second chance to serve. Not in war, but in memory. Not with bullets, but with truth. At night, he sat on the repaired porch with Emma beside him, and they watched the stars emerge, one at a time, like the names of old friends finally remembered. He didn't speak much anymore. He didn't need to. Gratitude had become its own kind of action, one that neither fades nor forgets. Part 4. Gate B12, where legends are welcomed. The airport was louder than he remembered. Not in volume, but in the way sound stretched, a baby's cry echoing too long, footsteps bouncing off steel and tile, the hum of bodies in motion clinging to the walls like breath on glass. Elias Grant moved through it slowly, not because of age, but intention. He had always believed entrances mattered, especially final ones. He wore his best suit. Navy, pressed, a quiet nod to the uniform he no longer owned but never stopped wearing in the marrow. His shoes were polished to a dignity that refused to scuff. In his left hand, he held nothing. In his right, a folded flag, small, worn soft by fingers that refused to forget. It wasn't ceremony that brought him here. It was something deeper. A pull. Gate B12. He reached it early. Sat in the hard terminal chair like it was a pew. Outside the window, planes drifted across the tarmac, slow and weightless, like old memories returning home. The screen above the gate flickered. Military honor flight. Arrival 11:20 a.m. A notice meant to inform. But for Elias, it felt like prophecy. He hadn't expected the invitation. It had arrived folded inside a letter with no seal, but the unmistakable scent of respect. "We'd be honored if you'd represent us at the arrival," it said. "You're part of the reason they're coming home to applause." At first, he wasn't sure he deserved the title. He had done his time. Yes. Buried brothers. Worn grief like a second skin. But this welcoming of others, it felt different. It felt sacred. The crowd was already forming. Families. Veterans. Young service members in crisp uniforms, shoes too tight, backs too straight. Children held flags. Older men wore ball caps embroidered with ships and unit numbers. A kind of unspoken code passed between them all, a glance, a nod, a silence that meant more than any anthem. And then a shift, a ripple. The first soldier stepped off the plane. He was young, barely older than Emma, with eyes that scanned the crowd like he didn't believe it was for him. Then another. And another. Wheelchairs, crutches, some whole, some visibly changed. But all met with cheers that cracked the sterile walls of the terminal wide open. People clapped not out of habit, but from the diaphragm, from the place where gratitude lives too large to keep inside. Elias stood. Slowly. His hands trembled, but he kept them at his sides. He did not salute. Not yet. He waited, watching. And then, one of the soldiers, tall, Latino, eyes fierce with recognition, spotted him. He stopped mid-step. His name tag read Reyes. Elias felt something rise in his chest that he didn't know how to contain. Reyes approached, steps hesitant, but eyes locked on Elias like he'd found something sacred he hadn't realized he'd lost. "Sir," the young man said, voice tight. "You came." Elias looked at him for a long moment, then gave a single nod. Not just of acknowledgement, but of arrival, of continuation. "I told you," he said quietly. "I show up." There was a pause. Then Reyes, still in uniform, still carrying sand in his boots from a land far from this polished terminal, pulled Elias into an embrace. Not formal, not for show, but fierce, grateful, aching. Around them, cameras clicked. Reporters whispered names. Children pointed. But Elias only saw one thing, the weight in this young man's shoulders lessening, even if just for a breath. He had known that burden. He had carried it for decades. Now he passed something else, an invisible inheritance. As more soldiers filed in, a quiet phenomenon began to unfold. They saw Elias, not as a celebrity, not as a symbol, but as something rarer, a witness. The man who had lived what they now knew. And they approached, one by one. A handshake, a word. Some just stood near him, saying nothing, as if proximity itself was comfort. The announcer's voice came over the speakers, but Elias barely heard it. He was elsewhere now, back in the jungles, the camps, the long nights when survival was less about guns and more about believing morning would come. And now it had. In this gate. In this generation that still marched forward, still carried the torch. A child, maybe 8 years old, approached and tugged at Elias's sleeve. He looked down. "Are you the hero from the videos?" the boy asked, eyes wide. Elias knelt, slow and deliberate, until he was eye level with the child. "I'm one of them," he said softly. "But the real heroes, they never made it to the airport." The boy nodded, solemn, then reached into his pocket and handed Elias a folded piece of paper. A crayon drawing. Elias could barely make it out. A man in uniform. A flag. And above it, in shaky block letters, "Thank you for keeping us safe." Elias held the paper like it was made of gold. The ceremony ended. The crowd began to thin. But Elias remained, seated now beside the window, the crayon drawing on his lap, the folded flag beside him. A silence filled him, not of absence, but completion, as if all the stories buried in his bones had finally found a place to rest. Outside, the runway glowed under the afternoon sun. Gate B12 would one day close. The chairs would empty. The signs would change. But on that day, in that moment, it had become something else. A cathedral. A threshold. A place where the forgotten were remembered. And where legends weren't buried. They were welcomed home. There are certain moments that do not announce themselves with fanfare. They arrive quietly, like dust settling on the edges of a memory, or a shadow crossing a man's heart long after the sun has set. Elias Grant did not sleep much after the ceremony at Gate B12. He didn't need to. His body was tired, yes, but his soul, it had found a strange peace. A kind of closing that didn't feel like an end, but rather a whisper of purpose rediscovered. That night, in the small apartment that had held more silence than conversation in recent years, Elias opened a box he hadn't touched since the funeral. Inside it, Letters, photographs, medals. The weight of a lifetime collapsed into paper and metal. He had once believed that closing this box would help him move on. Now he realized some marks are not meant to be healed. They are meant to be honored. He held a photograph in his hands. A younger version of himself stared back, shoulder to shoulder with friends whose names the world no longer spoke aloud. Their eyes were bright. Their posture was defiant. But what struck Elias most was how much they didn't know. How much they would come to carry. He traced the edge of the photo with a trembling thumb. "I told them I'd remember," he whispered. "And I did. Every damn day." In the morning, Elias dressed slowly. Not in the suit, but in something simpler. A wool sweater Emma had knit him years ago, one sleeve slightly longer than the other. It grounded him in something real. He walked through the streets of the city like a ghost gently refusing to disappear. No one recognized him, and for the first time he was grateful for that. Fame had never interested him. Legacy was something else. He stopped by a school, sat on a bench across from the entrance. The children were at recess, running in wide, chaotic loops of laughter. A teacher, maybe in her 30s, noticed him. She smiled, but didn't interrupt. Elias watched a boy climb the monkey bars, fall, get up, try again. That, he thought, is the rhythm of life we never escape. Fall, stand, repeat. Later, he visited the war memorial downtown. The cold granite walls bore names chiseled into permanence. His own wasn't there, but his heart felt etched into every one. A small group gathered nearby, young people on a field trip. One of them, a teenage girl with braids and a sketchpad, was drawing the monument. Elias stood behind her, silent. "You a veteran?" she asked suddenly, without turning. He hesitated. "I am." She nodded, still sketching. "Thank you. My granddad was one too." He never talked about it. Elias sat on the nearby bench, exhaling slowly. Sometimes silence says more than stories ever could. She looked up then. "But I think people need the stories. Otherwise, we forget the cost." He met her eyes, and for a flicker of a second, saw Emma. Not in face, but in fire. That same steady defiance, the kind that doesn't scream, but survives. He reached into his coat and pulled out the crayon drawing the boy had given him at the airport. Held it for a moment, then handed it to her. "Keep this," he said softly. It belonged to someone who understood what it meant to be safe. And someone else who fought to make sure he could stay that way. She took it reverently. "What's your name?" He paused. "Elias Grant." Her eyebrows lifted. "Wait, the Elias Grant." He smiled, almost shyly. "Just Elias is fine." That night, he began writing again. Not a book. Not speeches. Just letters. One to Emma. One to a man named Reyes. One to a fallen comrade whose mother still sent Elias Christmas cards, even decades after her son never came home. The words came slowly, but when they came, they did not stop. Each sentence stitched something shut in him, while simultaneously leaving the thread long enough for someone else to pick up. He knew now that his mark wasn't fame, wasn't medals, wasn't even survival. His mark was presence, endurance, witness. The simple act of showing up, not just once at a gate, but again and again in memory, in meaning, in the echo of footsteps others would take, because he had left a path behind. In the months that followed, strangers began writing him back. Young soldiers, wives of veterans, teachers, children. They had seen the footage, heard the story, felt the weight of his silence, and the power of his return. Some called him a legend. Others called him grandfather. One simply wrote, "Thank you for being proof we can come back." Elias never replied to all of them, but he read every word, because in them, he saw what so many men never lived to see, the continuation. In the end, he was not trying to be remembered. He was trying to ensure they were never forgotten. And that, he realized, was the mark that never fades.